right? So again, same amount of transmit power, but focus, which is going to allow me to get extended distance. And so again, that's what we're going to see when we look at the azimuth and the elevation plane diagrams. Here we can see the focus really is in that one direction. Depending on the type of antenna, the degrees that I'm covering will be different. Sometimes I'll be more focused, sometimes I might have a wider beam. Another interesting thing that you see here is there's actually a bit of energy coming out the back of the antenna. We actually saw the same thing in the omnidirectional. Things were coming out of the top of the antenna. And what's the implication there? Well, for the omnidirectional, or even this case, if I had it pointed, had it up mounted on the ceiling, I could be on the floor upstairs and I'm connected to the AP downstairs. And people say, why am I connected to the access point downstairs? Well, because the signal quality is better. That says less about the AP downstairs and more about the design of what you did of the floor that you're on. Obviously, where you have an AP is not as good for the signal of where you happen to be standing. So those are where you get some of the indications that maybe the design didn't actually end up like I thought it was going to end up. Now, because we're visual, typically when we look around the room and we see an access point, right, I immediately think of the line of sight signal. And there will be a direct line of sight signal, and that typically is going to be the best quality signal that I receive. However, we typically have walls, so things are going to go through walls. There's what we call attenuation through the wall. That's where the material in the wall is actually breaking up that signal a little bit, so the signal strength is going to drop. Everybody that's in this room, we are, I think it's around 80-something% water. We're really good at absorbing RF. So when you have an empty room, the signal looks really good, and then you fill the room, and all of a sudden we're all here sucking up all the RF energy, and that will have an impact on the coverage. But of course, there's not just that one component. Remember, I showed you the omnidirectional. We're sending out in all directions. And so there's parts of the signal that are now bouncing all over the room. Because they're taking different paths to reach my client, they're actually taking different lengths of time to reach. They're actually arriving out of phase with each other. And so this relates to a concept called destructive and constructive interference. And so what happens if I got all these multipath signals bouncing around at the receiver, I'm going to be listening to them and trying to make sense of them. Now, the first two look really good. I've got really strong signals, but they're completely out of phase. Whereas the bottom one is, a low signal, but it's in phase with the one above. And so what happens here, when I add those first two, because they're out of phase, I actually get a decrease in the signal strength. But when I add the bottom two, I actually get an increase. I do get a gain from that lower signal component that I see at the end. And so back in the olden days, we had to figure out how I was going to deal with all this multipath. And anyone recognize this access point? Anyone know which one that is? 1240 AG. It goes back to 802.11a, A, and G, and glad to say I'm not the only old person in the room. So back then, in the time of 11a and 11g, the way we dealt with this was what was called antenna diversity. I simply listened on my two radios. I figured out which was the better signal. I said, that's the one I'm going to use. And so I get the better quality signal when I hear you, and then when I trans back to you, I'm going to use that same antenna. Now, with 802.11n, we actually took a different approach to this. We introduced something called MIMO, multiple input, multiple output. And what we realized was, well, the only reason I got that bad signal in the first place was because I was adding up the two signals that are out of phase, but I can be a little more clever about that and adjust for the shift in phase. And now when I add them all together, I actually get a really good quality signal. And so this is what was introduced with 802.11n, the concept of MIMO. Now this really was a game changer because before, I'm actually trying to solve for the problem of multipath. With MIMO, all of a sudden, multipath is an advantage. I've got signals bouncing around corners, the coverage, and I get actually now a better signal at my receiver because I'm able to take all these different signals and make them effective. So this was actually a really big deal. Now, this is looking at from the receive side. I can do the same thing from the transmit side. So picture again those ripples in the pond, but instead of throwing one pebble, I throw two pebbles. Where those ripples intersect, I get an increase in energy. So if I can actually steer the beam with my second radio, and now basically I get the intersection point where you are, now I'm going to give you an increase in the signal quality. Okay? And so this is called transmit beamforming. Now, if you think about that, that implies that within my radio, I have multiple transmit and receive chains. And so normally what I would do is I'm doing that beam steering, and what I'm doing with those two transmitters is I'm sending my message serially. So both of them are going the quick brown fox. But I could also actually use each of those transmit and receive chains independently. And now I can send two parts of the message. So the quick brown fox, obviously getting a doubling factor in terms of the throughput that I'm able to get through the signal. What's the catch here? Well, the catch is I need the same number of receive and transmit chains on both sides. So my client needs to have the same as my device. And as I said, this is a pretty small device. It's hard enough to cram one radio into this. Cramming two becomes even more difficult. And so the end result is the majority of handheld clients, particularly on the low end, are only going to have one spatial stream. Your higher end, your iPhones, your Samsungs, at the top end, those will probably have two spatial streams, particularly the newer ones. Your tablets will have two. Laptops might have three. Maybe a high end could have four. But at the end of the day, I can only do the matching number of spatial streams. So what we then did with 802.11ac was say, all right, if I can't use all my spatial streams to one client, I have wasted capacity. So what if instead I send one spatial stream to you and your phone, and I'm going to send two to you and your laptop, and then I'm going to send one to you down in the back to your phone or your tablet. All right, and so now I'm actually making use of all the spatial streams that I have. But again, what's the catch? It's not that easy. Look at what we've got in the picture. When I send that one spatial stream to you, at the same time, I need to be decreasing the energy that I'm sending when I'm transmitting the other spatial streams to the other. The implication there is you've got your laptop and your phone right next to you. I can't do both to both of your devices. I'm going to do one to you, one to you, one to you, get a bit of spacing to allow it to work, but I'm going to be changing that up every time. So again, the idea is how do I make the most of the efficiency of the capabilities that I have? Now, the next piece of the puzzle we need to think about is, we've been talking a lot about getting signals out there, but at the end of the day, it's not about the signals, it's about the data. And so what I really want to do is I want to take this digital data, convert it into an analog signal, send it over the air, and then demodulate it on the other side back into the digital data. And that is what digital modulation is all about. And I can modulate my signal according to those different parameters that we talked about. I can modulate the amplitude, the frequency, and the phase. So a real simple example, here's my carrier signal, here's my modulation signal, and then this is going to be my amplitude modulated carrier, which is how we get AM radio and talk radio. So wonderful stuff. Another example, let's see what happens if I modulate the frequency, the phase. So this is QPSK, quadrature phase shift keying. And what I'm going to do, each phase shift will correspond to 2 bits, so 0, 1, 2, and 3. And so I'm effectively encoding 2 bits per symbol. Now, 2 bits per symbol, that's not really going to give us some high throughput. So what we actually use today in modern Wi-Fi is something called quadrature amplitude modulation, or QAM. And so what I'm going to do here is my symbols are actually a combination of amplitude and phase. The advantage of this is I'm going to be able to get high spectral efficiency, which is just a fancy way of saying I'm going to cram more bits into the pipe. The downside is it's going to be increasingly difficult to demodulate that signal in the presence of noise. So what's the implication of that? Well, here's that example. This is the 2 bits. So this is 4 QAM. I'm coding 0, 1, 2, and 3. On the receive side, this is how we would visualize it. This is called a scatter plot. And it looks messy, but I still have those groupings, 0, 1, 2, and 3. That's at a signal to noise ratio of 10. This is what it looks like at a signal to noise ratio of 6. It's a lot harder to differentiate those groups, isn't it? So you know what we're looking at there? That's a dropped packet. I can't demodulate it because I can't really tell those groupings. Now, we don't really care about 4 QAM because it's very, very low bit rate. And we don't even care about 16 QAM. Back in the 11N days, we were doing 64, then we moved to 256 QAM. With Wi-Fi 6 today, we're doing 1K QAM, and what's coming now with Wi-Fi 7 is 4K QAM, encoding 12 bits per symbol. But what you can see with each iteration is it's getting more and more complex, which probably means I need to have a better signal-to-noise ratio in order to support it. And that's exactly what the case is. There's a direct correlation between the modulation scheme that I can support and the signal-to-noise ratio. And so this is how, when we do our site surveys and we're doing our planning and I get visibility of, at this point in your environment, what is the signal-to-noise ratio I have, that tells me what data rate I can support. So looking back again at 4K QAM with Wi-Fi 7, I need a signal-to-noise ratio of 43. That is really high. That tells me I'm not going to be able to maintain that rate everywhere in the cell of my access point. And this is what we've seen with every iteration of the wireless standard. I improve my modulation scheme, which gives me an increase in my highest data rate, but even that has decreased over time, right? So it's not like I'm getting a doubling with every iteration. Moving now to Wi-Fi 7, I'm only getting a 20% boost. But I'm also decreasing my effective range for that highest data rate by half. So what does this mean? What are we kind of saying here? So if I've got my Wi-Fi 6 network up today, and I know that at the edge of my cell with that Wi-Fi 6 access point, I can hit that maximum data rate for the 1K QAM modulation scheme. I then replace that access point with a Wi-Fi 7 AP. I will still hit that maximum 1K QAM data rate at that 10 meters from the access point. But if I want now to take advantage of 4K QAM and get the higher Wi-Fi 7 data rate, I'm probably not going to get it from that point. I'm probably going to have to go another maybe 5 meters closer to the AP. And just from the work that we've been doing, you're probably a little less than 5 meters to maintain that maximum data rate. Because what's happening? I connected that data rate, I can't demodulate, I have to throttle back to the next lower modulation scheme, which has a lower SNR requirement. That's how I'm now able to maintain that connectivity, but at a lower throughput. All right, so how can I try and improve this? How can I try to ensure that I'm at least getting the highest data rate because I'm getting the best quality signal? Well, now we're going to take a page back from the olden days when we were doing antenna diversity and take advantage of what we call transmit-receive diversity. And so the example looks something like this. So this is a 4x4 access point, but I've disabled one of the radios. So it's effectively 3x3. And I'm going to do 3 spatial streams, and the colors represent the modulation scheme, the data rate that I'm supporting. And you can see it's all over the place. Close, I can hit high, but as I extend out, it gets less and less. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to re-enable that 4th antenna. And this is going to allow me to do transmit diversity. Again, what that is depending on where you are positioned, I'm going to figure out which that extra antenna is going to allow me to get a better signal to you. And now I get much better consistency in terms of my throughput across the cell because I'm able to improve the signal to noise ratio everywhere in the cell. On the receive side, we can see a similar effect. If I disable that 4th radio, I really can't support 3 spatial streams. Bulk of my traffic is going to be 2 spatial streams only. But if I re-enable that 4th one, now nearly half of my packets will be with 3 spatial streams. The rest, mostly will be dropping down to 2 spatial streams. The implication of this is I really want to be looking at N+1 in terms of the combination of spatial streams and then looking at what I'm going to get with my modulation scheme. So you'll see a lot of low-end access points that are 2 by 2. And what hopefully this is telling you is if you are deploying in high density, you're going to have a lot of users, you're going to be using high throughput applications, you do not want a 2 by 2 AP. You want a 4 by 4 AP that's going to give you that N+1 capability. On some of our high-end APs, we had dual 5 gig that I could actually combine into 8 by 8, and that would allow me to do a little bit more as well, particularly when you tie into multi-user MIMO. All right, so that's looking at those first 2 elements. We looked at looking at the dimensions. The third piece that we're going to talk about is channel aggregation. So when I talk about transmitting my wireless network, I operate on a channel, and we define channels as being 20 megahertz. You can see the gray. I've got some guardrails just to make sure that I'm not interfering with the channels next to me. And so if I want more throughput, more bandwidth, I can get that by increasing the bandwidth. I take 2 20 meg channels and turn them into a 40 meg channel. I take 240, turn it into an 80. I take 280, I can make 160. With Wi-Fi 7, I can actually take 2 160 meg channels and turn it into a 320 meg channel. That sounds great. Why haven't we been doing this all along? Well, the limitation is I've got limited spectrum available. In the 2.4 gig band, I have 80 megahertz of spectrum, which means I can really only get 3 channels because, again, those guardrails, I can't actually fit the 4th channel because I'm a little over 80 meg. The 5 gig band gave us a lot more space, so I actually can make effective use of 40 meg channels. And you might say, well, hey, I've got a bunch of those 80s as well. Like, why can't I do the 80 meg channels? Well, it comes down to how I do a high-density design. I need to make sure that none of my APs are near an AP on the same channel. I need non-overlapping channels. I need 7 non-overlapping channels in a high-density design. And I don't have 7 80 meg channels in the 5 gig band, which is why we're so excited about the 6 gig band, which has the potential to give me 1200 megahertz of additional throughput. So not only can I do 80 megahertz, I can do 160 megahertz channels. Of course, we don't have access to all that in Australia, do we? How much spectrum do we have in the 6 gig band in Australia? 500, right? We only get that, which is exactly the same that I had in 5 gig, which means I'm back to 40 meg channels. Now, the good news is the ACMA has been spending much of this year looking at what to do with that upper 700 megahertz. They are actually supposed to be making a decision before the very end of this year. So before the end of this year, we will find out whether or not we get the additional spectrum and how much. I will say they are looking at carving out at a minimum the top 100 megahertz for IMT or 5G. The problem with that, which we've told them, is if you do that, you're cutting off the edge of my last 160 meg channel, which means I'm going to be restricted to 80 meg channels here in Australia. So please give us the full 1200 megahertz. Do we have anyone from any other countries other than Australia? Where are you from? Poland? Oh, wow, that's EU. Yeah, I don't have good news for you at the moment. They're probably going to stay at 500 for a bit. If I look around Asia Pacific, pretty much every country in our part of the world has taken that 2-phase approach, opening us to the bottom 500. South Korea is the one exception. They actually opened up the full 1200 from the start. Now, the question is, why are regulators taking this kind of phased approach? And the answer is, well, 6 gig hasn't been lying empty waiting for us to show up. There's incumbents that are operating in that band, typically microwave and satellite links. And so the reason for the rules are basically the regulators want to ensure that they protect the incumbents while they still allow us to make use of the spectrum for Wi-Fi. The implication for us today is that we've got these different device classes. So you'll hear the term low power indoor and standard power. So everywhere in Asia Pacific at the moment and in Europe, you're basically operating under the low power indoor rules, which quite simply say you can only operate 6 gigahertz indoors and you can't use external antennas, specifically removable antennas. Why are they saying that? Well, because if I can put a higher gain antenna on that access point, now I'm breaking my low power rules, right? So that's why the restriction is. And for the most part, if you look across all the Wi-Fi 6E and all the Wi-Fi 7 access points that are out there, they will be indoor only and integrated antennas only. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, but if you get a Wi-Fi 6E or Wi-Fi 7 access point with external antennas that you can use outdoors, the implication is you're not going to be able to switch on the 6 gig radio, even if you're using it indoors, because again, it breaks the LPI rules. In order to support outdoors and external antennas, we need a capability called standard power. And standard power is going to use a capability called AFC, or automated frequency coordination, which put simply is basically saying, where's your Wi-Fi network? Where are the incumbents? Let's figure out what channels you can and can't use and what transmit powers. And so that's the work that regulators will have to do. Assuming the ACMA makes a good decision at the end of the year on the upper 700, my expectation is that next year they'll start looking at how we can bring standard power to Australia. Yep. All right, so the the wired. So sorry, what that is actually implying is just how we actually, what they don't want is you to basically be able to plug in other power sources, which then means I can take it outside. So yeah, just probably poor choice of words. I don't mean wireless power. That's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, basically we're saying we're defining what is required for the access point so that I don't need to worry that you are bringing it outdoors. Okay. You also see in the middle there's some things defined for clients, but those we won't worry so much about. All right. So the last piece that ties into is, so I can't use standard power in Australia yet. I'm limited to integrated antennas, but I want to be able to provide coverage in some tricky RF areas. And so that is where that AP up there, which is actually that AP up there. We have the 9166D1, which is a directional antenna as opposed to an omnidirectional antenna variant of the AP. This week, we're also announcing the 9176D1, which is the Wi-Fi 7 directional. And so the whole point of these is this is how I can provide 6 gig coverage in more complex RF areas. Think high ceilings, long hallways, lecture halls, and things along those lines. Okay. So these then are my 3 dimensions of wireless performance, right? So what did we end up with? We had spatial multiplexing. And what was the limiting factor for spatial multiplexing? Capabilities of the device, right? If I only have 1 spatial stream, I can't really do 2 spatial streams from the AP. Next one, digital modulation. What did we say the limiting factor was there? Signal noise ratio. I need a good signal noise ratio to handle those high data rates. And last but not least, channel aggregation, which is dependent on the spectrum that I have available. All right, there's one last piece we need to talk about because I actually don't use quadrature amplitude modulation by itself to send my data. We actually use something called multi-carrier modulation, or more specifically, OFDM, which is really a combination of modulation and multiplexing. And so the idea behind OFDM is I'm going to take my channel, and I'm actually going to split it up into subchannels or subcarriers. And so then on each of those subchannels, that's where I'm going to run my quadrature amplitude modulation. So I get that multiplexing effect across my channel. People have heard that people talk about that parts of Wi-Fi, modern Wi-Fi was invented here in Australia. Yeah? This is what we're talking exactly. CSIRO. The CSIRO patent ties directly to this, to OFDM. It was actually tied to the Department of Radiophysics. They weren't doing anything with Wi-Fi. They were looking at how to see signals coming from outer space to clean up those signals to look at black holes. But what they realized was, well, if I can clean up signals coming from outer space, I probably can clean up a Wi-Fi signal as well. And well, the rest is history. Now, again, I like to be able to visualize these things because I know this is like getting a little recursive. I've got my modulation on top of my modulation and multiplexing and things like that. I find the simplest way to understand OFDM, when you get home at the end of the week, go in your room, switch off the light, put on second side of dark side of the moon, it will all become clear. That picture of the prism, think about it. White light refracted into the individual colors. Those individual colors, the reason we see the individual colors, that is the electromagnetic radiation at different frequencies, each frequency relating to a different color. So that is my sub-channel. So that's the way I always visualize it. I am doing my QAM on those different colors, my different sub-channels. Make sense? All right. Now, this took us all the way from 802.11a all the way up to 802.11ac. And if you remember where I was showing you, we kept increasing the modulation scheme, but we were getting increasingly diminished returns. So we realized that we needed to do something different. And what we decided to do different was improve the efficiency of how we were using OFDM. The challenge with OFDM is, yeah, I split all that channel into subchannels, but only one device could ever talk on a channel at a given time. So with 802.11ax, we introduced OFDMA. The MA stands for multiple access. And now I can have multiple devices pile onto that wireless frame. So again, a way to visualize that, I've got, say, my 40 meg channel, and I'm going to give 20 megahertz to one device, 20 megahertz to another device. And so in this way, I actually can have more devices pile on at once, similar to what we were doing with multi-user MIMO. And so the way you can kind of look at this, I've got my channel, I break it up into those separate resource units. Every device gets a resource unit. What's really cool about this is if I'm going to transmit on a resource unit a smaller channel, right? Remember what we talked about with I've got finite energy, I'm spreading over a wider channel. So if I'm only going to use 2 megahertz out of the 20 megahertz, think about what that means in terms of my transmit power. If I use the same transmit power I was going to use for 20 megahertz, I probably am going to get a bit more distance off of that, right? Because I'm using it now for a much smaller channel. Or I can reduce my transmit power and hit the same distance that I would have done with more power at 20 megahertz. So this also gives us some power efficiency for my small devices, which are obviously running on battery, and I want to have power savings. All right, now we're really going to go a little crazy. So I'm going to take my OFDMA, and I'm going to layer on top of that multi-user MIMO. Mind blown. So what does this look like? So I've actually got just one resource unit, but now I'm talking to multiple devices with my multi-user MIMO. So this is really, really cool stuff. This is how I'm getting efficiency. It's not just about raw throughput. It's about how I can make better use out of the throughput and the spectrum that I have. Now, 2 last bit of enhancements. First one, and these are what coming in Wi-Fi 7. So I've got this concept of the resource unit, and that's going to allow me to do some interesting things. So what happens today if I have interference on one of my 20 meg channels? Got to take out the whole 20 meg channel. I can't use it. But with resource units, what I now can do is something called puncturing, which basically says, hey, it's only 1 megahertz of interference in the whole 20 meg band. What if I just say, nope, don't use that 2 megahertz resource unit? That's how I now can get, again, better spectral efficiency. I've got limited spectrum. I don't want to have to take out a whole 20 meg channel. Now I can still use parts of that channel effectively. The other interesting feature coming in Wi-Fi 7 is called MLO, multi-link operation. And the interesting thing here is, so Wi-Fi 6E was the first time we extended Wi-Fi into the 6 gig band. But when we were working on 802.11be, which would become Wi-Fi 7, this was the first time that we're like, hey, I've actually got 2 usable bands to play with, 5 gig and 6 gig. Yes, I've got 2.4, but that's never going to do much for me with only 3 channels that I can use. And so what we said was, well, you know what? What if my client, instead of having one radio that can just look and use the 3 bands, what if it actually has 2 radios that can actively use more than 1 band? And so now I could get, say, multiband aggregation and be transmitting on both 5 and 6 gig or receiving on both 5 and 6 gig. But really cool is I can actually have full duplex Wi-Fi with simultaneous transmit and receive, one on one radio, one on the other radio. So this, again, is going to tie to the capabilities of the client. This is something we'll see evolve over time. Remember, I'm trying to cram a lot of radios into a very small device. We are starting to see some of the early implementations on some of the early Wi-Fi 7 devices, but I would expect to see this expand a little bit more over time. At the end of today, one of the last sessions of the day, my friend Anand is going to be doing a session on Wi-Fi 6E and Wi-Fi 7. He'll be talking about the new APs. Definitely recommend that you check that out at the end of the day. All right, so that kind of lays the foundation for how Wi-Fi works. In the last piece, I just quickly want to kind of go through how we're going to kind of take advantage of this to now design and optimize my Wi-Fi network. And I think the important thing that we need to think about here is there are two parts to the equation. I've got my access point and I've got my client. And those are very, very different types of devices, right? That access point, we've designed that with awesome radios that are in it. We've got great antennas. It's connected to UPoE power, so it's got full power for everything it needs to do, as compared to this. And don't get me wrong, my iPhone is an awesome little device, but it is a little device with a little battery, okay? And so there's going to be a disparity. There's also a disparity because how we all use our devices is different. Let me give you a quick example. So what's the difference between these two pictures? Quick, tell me the difference. What's the difference? What do you see? The difference between those two pictures? Yeah, one's on voice and the other guy is like doing something. He looks vaguely young, so it's probably TikTok. So he's doing that. And that's a very reasonable answer. You know what I see when I look at that and you ask me what the difference is? I look at that and I go, about 20 dB. Because he's holding it to his head, right? And so if the AP is on the other side, that RF signal has to go through my thick skull in order to be able to connect to that. So, you know, if you think about it, Steve Jobs wasn't quite wrong when he said you're holding it wrong. There is an impact to how you're holding it and how that signal is going to propagate. Again, I'm trying to cram a radio into this really, really tiny device. I'm not sure if you can see this. The antenna here is kind of a squiggle there. Remember I said the antenna needs to be a multiple of the band width. So for 2.4, I use the full length of that antenna. For 5 gig, I'm only going to use half of that antenna. And just to make things really awkward, 5 correlates to 6 centimeters, but 6 gig correlates to 5 centimeters. So we've got to play some games to make a tri-radio antenna work nicely. The implication of all this is there's really going to be disparity between the devices, between all the different devices, and even a single device over time. And we kind of came up with this graph to help kind of get a sense of what we're talking about. So we were collecting data for about 6 months. And I want to kind of show you the implication here. So what we're basically saying is 30% of the time, the RSSI value, the received signal strength that I see at the client and I see at the access point match. So the AP and the client see each other in exactly the same way. But 50% of the time, there's actually a 6 dB difference. 90% of the time, there's a 15 dB difference. That's a huge disparity. That is what makes your life miserable trying to design a really good wireless network, how you're going to balance all of this. And so this comes back to why it's so important to think about how I am designing my network down to the antenna level. And I like to use this as an extreme example because it's a stadium and stadiums are very extreme environments. But what normally they want to do is put the access point up at the top of the bleachers, aim the energy down there. It's very easy to deploy the access point because you're deploying it right there in the building. I've got all my network connectivity there. From a deployment perspective, it's perfect, which has absolutely nothing to do with why I'm trying to deploy access points. The purpose of deploying the access point is not to make it easy for the installer. Because what's happening? I'm aiming that signal at everybody's back down as you get into the bleachers, and everyone's holding the phone in front of them. This is why we designed the 9104 stadium antenna. This gives me very high directional gain. I can get up to 50 meters. And so yes, it's harder to do that deploying. I probably got to run fiber up there, get up in the catwalks. But now I'm actually getting the signal pointing where I need to point it. And so this is a really hard argument to have when you're talking to the people that actually need to deploy the stuff and all the costs associated, but you got to come back to the actual point. Why are we deploying these APs? We're not deploying these APs to make it easy to deploy these APs. We're deploying them to actually get a good Wi-Fi experience. And again, this ties to why we have the directional antenna, at least looking at what can I do indoors until we get standard power here in Australia. All right, now, typically what we find in wireless networks, the number one problem that we have is typically the end user, right? I mean, that's just networking in general. And one of the problems with wireless networks is people realize, oh, I'm connected wirelessly, therefore I have mobility, so I can actually move. I guess that's kind of the benefit in why we deploy wireless networks, but it does make things a little tricky. And so we need to think about how those client devices are going to roam from one access point to another access point. And to make things really, really simple for us, every single vendor is going to do something completely different. And they're even going to do things differently across their different products that they have. So let's take a quick look. So here I've got an iPhone, an iPad, an iOS device. It's going to wait until the signal strength is about -70, and then it's going to start looking for a better access point to join. And it will move if it finds something 8 dB better. Unless it's just sitting in my pocket idle, then it'll wait for 12 dB better. Now, if we're talking about a MacBook, though, it does something completely different. It waits to -75 and moves at 12. Samsung tries to be a little bit more clever, and so they're going to start looking at -75, but if there's a lot of devices, a lot of channel utilization in the space, they're actually going to look earlier at -65, and they'll move at 10. By the time we get to Intel chipsets, right, well, now all bets are off because every vendor making a laptop with an Intel chipset, they're going to do something completely different. We're going to get a huge variance there. So at the end of the day, we need to design kind of around the average and the best ever. The other thing to think about is most people still aren't walking around with their laptop doing, a WebEx or a Teams call or whatever. There are some people that do that, but most people are going to use a handheld device. So I'm going to design more around that from a roaming perspective. So let's think about that, using the iPhone example. So the edge of the cell basically is defined by when that client is going to start looking for a new AP to join, which for the iPhone we said was -70. So it wants to find an AP that's 8 dB better, which means that at that point, it should find another AP at -62, right? Which defines my midpoint as -66. So when I'm trying to decide, how to do the spacing for my access points, this is part of the equation. Now, it also ties into transmit power and some other things, but ultimately, I'm designing around that midpoint to have overlapping cells to make roaming work nicely. Now, this is looking from a 5 gig perspective, but a 2.4 gig radio, because it's a different frequency, a lower frequency, that propagates differently. And so at the same transmit power, my client will hear the 2.4 gig radio about 7 dB higher, which means that what I might actually do is roam from one AP to the same AP just to the 2.4 gig radio. So typically what I want to do is I actually want to reduce the transmit power on the 2.4 gig radio so I can maintain similar cell size. And again, cell is defined by how the client is hearing the AP. So how do I manage that cell size? And I kind of hinted at it just before, talking about, well, I can change the transmit power, and that is going to change how the client is going to hear me. So at different transmit powers, that reduces the cell. What else can I do? I can use a high gain directional antenna like that 9104 Stadium antenna that I had. So the interesting thing, or rather what makes Stadium design so complex, is not just all the heights and things like that, but it is a completely open environment. I don't have nice walls and things that I have in other environments. That means every access point in the entire stadium is going to hear every access point in the entire stadium. And so part of what we did when we designed the 9104 is we really made very, very tight bands in terms of the coverage, because I want to avoid being able to hear all the other APs. And so again, that is going to allow me to limit the cell edge. I can also change the mandatory data rate. How does changing the mandatory data rate? What did we say? Data rate ties the modulation scheme. Modulation scheme is dependent on signal to noise ratio. So if I disable the low data rates, basically what I'm saying is I need a higher signal to noise ratio in order to be able to connect to that access point, right? So I typically disable the lower data rates, and really what I'm looking at is the mandatory data rate, because the client needs to be able to hit that modulation scheme at that lowest mandatory data rate in order to connect to the AP. So that's how I can reduce the cell size. Last but not least, there's a more advanced topic, receiver started packet. We'll touch on that in a minute. But just to go back to transmit power, what I want you to think about is that cell size, remember we said, is determined by the client. So yes, I'm going to change the transmit power, but what I really am caring about is my client and how the AP is going to hear it. And so we need to look at the transmit power of my client devices. And so again, everything's kind of different. A laptop's, got bigger batteries, bigger radios. It can get a bit higher transmit power as opposed to my smaller devices. The older devices will be a little worse. And so roughly what we want to do is kind of pick something. And so at the moment, what our recommendation is, pick around 14 dB. That should cover your cheaper, older devices for the most part. We'll give a 3 dB buffer. And so that means I probably want my max AP power to be roughly around 17 dBm. And so then I can get that set up. All right, what about that receiver started packet concept? So this is almost the inverse, the AP kind of view on what we were talking about of reducing getting rid of the mandatory data rates from the client perspective. What we're going to do here is basically tune how my access point radio decides whether or not to demodulate the packet. And so what we're basically saying, if the signal strength is really low, just ignore it. Don't even bother trying to decode it. I probably could decode it, but to maintain my cell size, I'm saying please don't. And so what we're basically saying is by increasing receiver started packet, I'm decreasing my radio sensitivity, which is reducing the cell size. So there's a bunch of different ways to tune it, but my number one thing, I'm not suggesting this so you now go and play with RxSOP. You really want to be doing it because you know what you're doing. You've done a site survey. You understand what you're trying to get with cell size, and you're not doing this everywhere. You're typically doing this on an AP basis to tune very, very specifically. But the reason why I raise it is an important tool in the toolbox when I'm trying to deal with complex RF environments. It's so important and critical. We've actually even brought it into Meraki Dashboard, even though typically we want things to be simple and we try to make it that you can't shoot yourself in the foot. So if you do try to shoot yourself in the foot, you will get a warning saying you might be about to shoot yourself in the foot. Click through that, and then we'll get the same capabilities that we have natively on Catalyst Center and the controller. But again, that's something you're going to do because you're doing some very specific design work. Now, at the end of the day, I've been talking about really the fundamentals of this and how we design, but you're not going to be doing this by hand. You're not going to be doing some static implementation because our wireless networks, the environments are not static, right? They are very dynamic. And so that's why we use solutions like radio resource management and AutoRF. These are just mathematical algorithms that are going to take what we've done and try and figure out how to maintain that optimal state in terms of things like transmit power and channels and things along those lines. So it's important to really understand what it is doing. All we're doing is dynamically optimizing your environment. It's equally important to understand what we are not doing. We are not substituting for a site survey or correcting poor RF design. If you take an access point and you mount it pointing right at a metal air conditioning duct, there is no math in the world that's going to make that work right. It is just not. Okay, so the number one rule of algorithms like this is to remember it does not manufacture spectrum or otherwise counteract the laws of physics. If you have a very poor design, this will optimize the hell out of it and you'll still have a very poor outcome. Okay? So really important that this does not, allow you to take any shortcuts in what you're doing. Now, tomorrow afternoon, my friend Jim Florek, he is actually going to be doing a whole session on how we have evolved RRM and AutoRF, how we are using artificial intelligence and machine learning to pull in heaps more data to be even more efficient and effective with that. But even with artificial intelligence and machine learning, I'm still not going to fix a bad fundamental design, okay? But definitely recommend you get to see Jim tomorrow afternoon. I'm very excited, first time that we actually brought him out here in Melbourne for Cisco Live. Now, the last piece, and I get this a lot, some of you in the room have actually had these conversations over the last year or so, is all right, you've been focusing on 2.4 and 5, what do I need to do differently to design for 6 gigahertz? So you'll remember I talked about 5 and the 2.4 difference. We said it was roughly 7 dB difference at the same transmit power. Between 5 and 6, it's about a 2 to 3 dB difference, but in the other direction. And so I've got a very simple rule of thumb for what you're going to do as you look at how do I take my existing design and move to a 6 gig design. And my starting point is, how do you feel about your design now? Like, are people complaining about the Wi-Fi coverage? Is it good? Is it bad? How's the roaming? If everything is good, then you should be okay. The next thing to check is, do I have any of my access points, that 5 gig radio at max transmit power? If you do, I'd suggest that maybe that design isn't as good as you think it is, because you really shouldn't have any APs operating at max transmit power. And the benefit from a 6 gig design perspective is if you don't have them at max power, that means now when I swap those out and put a 6 gig capable radio there, my 6 gig radio, I'm just going to tune 1, maybe 2 at most power levels higher. That will allow me to have a common cell size between 6 and 5. Okay, make sense? All right. This now kind of leads into, and we started talking about from RRM, I need to do some proper planning. And I always tell customers, really, please do a site survey. And sometimes they will say, I would love to do a site survey, but the building doesn't exist yet, or we haven't moved in yet, and I need to know how many APs I need, and things like that. So that's where an RF planning tool comes into play. And I've got a very simple rule when it comes to RF planning tools, and that is all models are wrong, and planning tools are based on models, but some of them are useful. And so it's just really important to understand what the planning tool is going to give you and equally what it is not going to give you. And so the planning tool is really, really useful for getting a sense of, hey, I've got the building plans, I need to know how many APs roughly, where I'm going to put them, things along those lines. It's really important that you actually put the data into the planning tool to get it as accurate as possible. So we've got Ekahau and Amina both in the world of solutions. They both got some RF planning tools. They have all of the Cisco AP and antenna models in it, so you can model everything. What you need to do is take your floor plan and mark up all the walls in the floor plan, and more importantly, put in what the actual material type is. There's a big difference between a gyprock wall and a glass wall in terms of what impact that's going to have on your RF signal. So the more that you put into that planning model to make it accurately reflect reality, the closer you will be to getting some good output out of that. But that said, and just want to quickly point out, and again, go to the Ekahau and Amina stands at World Solutions. Both of those integrate into Catalyst Center and Meraki Dashboard. So the benefit of that is you've just done all this work in the planning tool, putting in the maps and the walls and all of that gets sucked into Catalyst Center and Meraki Dashboard. So we don't lose that. You've done your AP placements, all of that gets pulled in. And so it reduces the risk of basically error because you're now copying data between two different tools. And again, in Jim's session tomorrow, I think he's also going to cover some of that as well. This doesn't get rid of the need to do a site survey. Oftentimes I've plenty of times customers have said, I talked to your competitor and they said they don't need to do a site survey. Okay? Go back to my rule on radio resource management. Interestingly, every vendor in the world, we are all subject to the same laws of physics. Go figure. Marketing does wonderful things, but marketing does not counteract the laws of physics. So really important to do a site survey because I need to match what I predicted to what is real. And oftentimes, they're going to make changes to those plans by the time they go and do it. You think you're going to put your access point there, and then there's going to be some reason why the builder can't put their access point there, and so you need to adjust for that accordingly. Really important is it also lets you get a sense of spectrum use that's already happening. True story. We were doing a wireless first deployment, Circular Key, beautiful building, one of those big financial companies. It was a wireless first office. So they had everything, everywhere was beautiful, lots of access points. Very first day, everybody shows up and nothing works. And so what's going on? Well, the very first day, the same day that everybody shows up into the office, a cruise ship showed up at the international passenger terminal there. What do cruise ships have? They have radars. What do radars do? Radars take out a big chunk of my Uni 2 extended band. They also, because it was all sustainable and everything, they had this great setup. The lights would automatically go on and off when you went into the bathroom. So they had sensors for that, and those sensors operated in the Uni 3 band, the top of my 5 gig band. So I had this wireless first network where basically more than half the channels I didn't have access to. Right? And so if we had done a proper site survey up front and actually got a sense of the spectrum use, we probably would have caught that ahead of time. Now, we were able to adjust it. We changed the sensors in the bathrooms to something that's not going to wipe out my Wi-Fi network. The DFS channels, the impact is really on the APs to the front of the building, so I just need to do some tuning with radio resource management to say, hey, don't use those channels because you're going to get knocked off all the time. Use those further back. We do the same thing if anyone's been to the Opera Bar. We have the same problem at the Opera Bar there. We use those channels further back in the Sydney Opera House. But these are the sorts of real-world things that the site survey gives you. All right. Next kind of piece of the puzzle here, and again, I keep coming back to thinking about the client, but this time I'm actually not thinking so much of the client device. I'm thinking about the user of the client device. So before we were talking about I'm designing for roaming based on what the client is going to do. Now I want to design for roaming based on what I'm going to do. And so I need to take the actual physical design of my environment into account. So real simple example. I got a building, 2 hallways, corridor down the middle, those crosshatch, those are the lifts. Lifts are typically made with what? Metal. What does metal do to my RF signal again? Really, really bad things. Okay, so from just physically laying it out, it looks good. I got these wonderful overlapping cells. It's all really good, except that AP1 and 2 can't see AP3 and vice versa. So what happens? I'm walking down that hallway. I'm connected to AP1. AP1 says, hey, if you need to roam, just so you know, AP2 is down there. And if I had walked down that hallway straight, everything would be fine. But instead, I turn the corner and walk down towards point C. And at some point, I hit that minus 70 dBm point, and my client goes, oh, it's time to look for a new access point. Oh, but you know what? AP1 was very, very nice. They told me to try AP2. Except by this point, I'm past the lifts, and I can't see AP2. And by the way, I can't see AP1 anymore either. We now do what we call a panic scan. I'm scanning every channel in my available spectrum. Ultimately, I will land on AP number 3. I will do my roam successfully. But there's been a bit of a delay until that happens. And so if this was one of my children that were walking there and their TikTok video was interrupted, God forbid, for all of like 2 seconds, I would hear about it for the rest of the week. How come you're like this Wi-Fi guy and the wireless in the house is so horrible? All right, the wireless is fine, just the roaming was not designed very well there. So how do I address this? Well, I need to think about how people are going to be moving in my environment and how each AP sees each AP. So in this scenario now, AP1 can see AP2, which can see 3. And so now when I'm telling the clients where to look, everything flows nicely. Make sense? Now, that's really an extreme case. What I see more often is what we call a ping pong zone. And so here, what we're talking about is there's this period, there's this block in the area where my signal quality is right on that, minus 70 dBm edge, and from all the APs that I can hear well. And so there really isn't a good place to roam to. Where do I see this? Typically in a school, university, a hospital, where you're doing your Wi-Fi design. It's like, where should we put the APs? Well, the kids are going to be in the classroom. The patients are going to be in the ward. That's where the APs go. What about the hallway? Why would I need an AP in the hallway? Well, I need the AP in the hallway because when I walk down that hallway and I've got the APs in the room, I'm going to ping pong back between them. And yes, I'm not doing a lot of stuff, but there are people that are walking down that hallway expecting good quality connectivity and real-time applications to work. So I just, again, need to think about how are people moving in my environment? How am I handing them off from one access point to the next? Now, look, it's not like, the earth is flat and you're just going to fall off the edge of the world, except in that extreme case with the lifts. In general, we're going to do this smoothly. And we actually have a couple protocols to simplify that. And so the 2 that we'll focus on today are 802.11k and 802.11v. From a Wi-Fi alliance perspective, you might hear multi-band operation. And so 802.11k is actually what we talked about before in the previous example. That's where my access point is going to say, hey, here's my neighbor access point. So if you need to roam, try these ones first. You don't need to scan every channel. Just try these ones. You should be able to go. The next one is 802.11v. And this is where I can be a bit more prescriptive and say, you know what, just go there. The typical place we use this is actually going back to that radar event example. When I get that radar event, I need to vacate that channel immediately. So I can quickly send a message to everybody saying, hey, I'm moving to this channel. I'll see you over there. And so then all the clients will move. There is a third protocol as part of multi-band operation. It's 802.11r. That ties more into the security and the authentication piece, so I won't cover it here, but I'll give you a plug for my wireless security session tomorrow where I will talk about 802.11r. So this is how I'm trying to optimize the roaming to make things work as I move through. The next thing that we need to think about, though, is it's not just one client in my network, right? I got lots of clients, and they're all trying to connect to the AP, talk to the AP. And so we need to actually take a step back and think about not how wireless works at the RF layer, but how wireless works at the MAC layer. How do I negotiate access to the medium? And so we refer to Wi-Fi as a polite protocol. It's listen before talk. If I have a packet to send, the very first thing I do is just listen to the medium. Is anyone on the medium? No? Okay, then I can try and transmit. Oh, someone else transmitted at the same time. We had a collision. All right, I will back off a random amount of time, and then I will try again. And so this works really well, except as more and more people come onto the network, what I end up doing is I'm spending a lot more time listening than I am talking. And this is the contention breaking point. This is basically what you're seeing here. As more clients come on, we get this extended delay as I'm contending for access to the medium. And we can see the impact of that in terms of throughput, right? My throughput basically does this hockey stick and plateaus out. Now that's OFDM, but the blue line, That's OFDMA. That's that multiple access. That's where I'm using the resource units. This was why we moved from OFDM to OFDMA. This is the efficiency that I was gaining by allowing multiple devices to pile onto that Wi-Fi frame. Now that's looking at throughput. I can also look at it through the lens of latency. Anybody designed their wireless network for real-time voice and video? Remember the Cisco validated design? What's the maximum number of clients that we recommend? You shouldn't have any more than this active voice or video clients connected to an access point. What's the number? Top of the head? Anyone? 25, exactly. That is that point right there. That's where the hockey stick starts going up and my latency increases, because I'm aiming for, I want to be below 100 milliseconds to have a really good voice and video experience. So that is why we basically say 25. Again, that was OFDM. OFDMA allows me to have a lot more consistency as I go. Now, it's not infinite. It's not going to extend, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. But it does allow me to get a significant improvement in terms of the latency just by allowing multiple clients to pile onto the frame. Now, we also want to address quality of service from a more traditional networking perspective. We have these different queues. So hopefully you're familiar with, we got the bronze, the silver, the gold, and the platinum, depending on the class of service, ties into the DSCP values. And what's interesting is how we actually make quality of service work. So I talked about how if there's a collision, I have that random backoff. And so how do I pick the range that I'm going to do that random backoff for? Well, the range correlates to the priority queue that I'm in. So if I've got a high priority platinum queue packet to send, the range that I'm going to get that random number is less. So the odds of me getting access to the medium are much higher than someone in the bronze queue that's going to be picking a range in a much larger area. There's still a probabilistic chance that that low priority packet will go, but the chances are higher for the higher priority packet. So that's how we make that work. Bottom line is you take all these different pieces together and you put them together. The impact is with both quality of service and multi-band operations, I can keep the latency below that 100 millisecond mark, which is what I want again for real-time voice and video. And if that was all I needed to design for, that would be absolutely fantastic. But of course, now what I'm focusing on is the next generation of applications that are coming. And these are actually going to want latency at an order of magnitude less. I need to start designing for 10 milliseconds or better. Things like virtual reality, augmented reality, they require really, really low latency. Why? It's what we refer to as photon to motion latency, which is a fancy way of saying when I turn my head, the image moves smoothly and I don't get motion sick and embarrass myself in front of the classroom. So I need to have really low latency for those applications. AI, we're pushing AI applications closer to the edge. Think about I'm doing WebEx and I'm getting real-time translation on my WebEx call, not just getting the subtitles up there in my native language, but I'm actually getting voice translation in my native language, like having the Babel fish in your ear, right? To do that, I've got to push stuff out to the edge. I've got to have really low latency. So one more thing. Some of you that have been deploying Cisco wireless for a long time, you're probably aware that over several years, we've actually had a really tight relationship with Apple. And we've actually, over time, we've developed a couple cool technologies, really just looking at addressing some corner case scenarios. But from Apple's perspective, their focus is on the user experience. So it's always tied to things that we can do to improve the user experience. So one example of that is in the early days of 802.11r, when we had client compatibility issues, we came up with something called adaptive 11R, where the Cisco network would recognize that it had an Apple device connecting, the Apple device would recognize it was on a Cisco network, and it would use 11R, but we wouldn't advertise 11R, so we wouldn't break things for the old legacy clients that didn't know how to deal with it. We also developed technology called Fastlane, which was really just looking at how I optimized quality of service so that we can improve how the app experience was, again, traversing over a Cisco network. For Wi-Fi 6, looking at OFDMA, we created a new capability called Fastlane Plus. And this ties into something that we call the advanced scheduling request. But first, let's take a quick step back. And again, thinking about how OFDMA works. Remember what I said, I now can have multiple devices pile onto my frame with the resource units. If I've got a lot of clients, I've got high channel utilization, my buffers are going to start to fill up. And so what I do is I send a buffer status report to basically say, hey, this is the status of my 4 queues. I'm going to need resource units in order to clear my buffers. But think about the implications of what we're doing. So my high priority voice and video queue is already now full. And instead of sending those packets, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send a packet to tell you that I need to send a packet. Okay, kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And what I've really done is I've introduced now jitter into my voice and video stream, which is exactly what we don't want to be doing. So instead, we developed this capability, which is called the advanced scheduling request, which at the start of my WebEx call, my FaceTime call, I basically tell the network and say, hey, I'm going to be doing this real-time application. I'm going to be needing these resource units at this regular period in order to make sure that I am sending the packets when I need to send them. And so that is Fastlane Plus. That's what we implemented with Apple in Wi-Fi 6. The good news is we then seeded that technology into Wi-Fi 7, so it's actually part of the 802.11be standard. But just to show you really quickly kind of the impact and why this is important, what we're looking at here is both voice and video packets. And what I'm looking at is, for each packet, what is the latency that I had? And so the green one is just normal OFDMA using the buffer status report. The gray is when I'm doing Fastlane Plus. And basically what you can see is, for the most part in the voice, every packet is sent at least less than 30 milliseconds. Most are at 10 seconds. I think there's a tiny fraction of something above that. You can barely see it in the 30 to 100 column. For video, still really good, but I do have a couple packets that are in that 30 to 100 milliseconds. And of course, video codecs usually are able to lose a few frames here and there, so it ends up being okay. In the Wi-Fi 7 world, we refer to this as triggered uplink access optimization. And so this is now, again, part of the standard. It's not just with Wi-Fi 6 on the Cisco and the Apple devices. Okay, so some pretty cool stuff. There's still constant innovation happening in this space. So let's start to wrap things up. Let me kind of pull it all together for you here. Yep. So in the Wi-Fi 6 world, the non-Apple device is just going to do the standard OFDMA. It'll just do that. So again, kind of some of the hooks that we've done with Apple is, so the question is what happens for a non-Apple device, right? So in the Wi-Fi 6 world where we're using that. So as I said earlier, Apple and Cisco, we do a little bit of a handshake when the Apple device joins the network. So the Apple device get, oh, okay, I'm on a Cisco network. We get visibility, this is an Apple device. In fact, Apple sends us a whole bunch of information about the client, which is a whole nother conversation. I get really good visibility. In fact, we got that relationship with Samsung, with Intel. And so they give us a little bit more info. So when I look at those problems with roaming and things like that, I actually understand why the clients are doing what they're doing. So if my client drops off the network because it's actually in my pocket and it's just gone to sleep, right? Normally I wouldn't know. I'm like, God, why'd the client drop? But with a Samsung or an Apple or an Intel device, it'll actually say, oh, I went to sleep, that's why I disconnected, or oh, my user just put the device into airplane mode. So that's sort of the things that we get from that direct relationship. Any other? Yep. Yeah. So the question is, as we bring new access points like Wi-Fi 7 into my point, what are things we should be thinking about? And specifically, should I at least have different floors? And yes, my typical rule of thumb is I want like with like. I don't want to mix them, definitely not at the floor level. If possible, I actually prefer to keep it like for like at a building level. And the reason for that is pretty simple, because I'm always going to be pulled back to the lowest common denominator. Remember, even if you've got separate floors, I probably will still see the APs depending on how you've tuned the network between the floors, right? And what we don't want is people come in with their brand new shiny iPhone 16 and they're connecting, but instead of connecting to the Wi-Fi 7 AP, they're connecting to the Wi-Fi 6 or 6E AP, and they say, I don't see any difference. So by keeping like with like, you're getting the maximal benefit where you've actually deployed the APs. It is the same bracket, so we do keep that. We've had the same bracket going back several generations, so you literally can pull it out, put the new one in, and as I said before, just check your transmit power as long as you've got room, so I can put the 6 gig radio slightly higher than your 5 gig radio. You should have the exact same coverage, both 5 and 6 gigahertz. Look, this is actually a contentious point. We really have not been of the opinion that a dual cable approach is the right approach. A couple reasons. One, it's extra cost to run the extra cables, but more important, everything that I put into an access point impacts heat. And so having an additional switch port that I need to power takes more power, uses more heat. Heat ties into my mean time between failure rates. Like, I only want what's there. Maybe you've heard Cisco actually has done a lot in the switching space. So like we've got multi-gigabit, we've got power over Ethernet. Like, we can do it with one Ethernet port. We also optimize the design of our APs to minimize the power that I need. So, looking back to AC, a lot of people had 2 ports because they actually couldn't power the AP with just AT power. So they really needed 2 ports to do that. They came up with some other reasons why they had it, but thinking about what we just talked about for wireless design, I'm not designing my AP resiliency based on multiple switches. I'm basing it on RF coverage. Lee Jewell has a session talking about wireless first design. Apology, I can't remember if it's today or tomorrow, but that is part of what he goes into explicitly, how we design for resiliency. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So when we were looking at like the Wi-Fi 6 days, if I was really pushing stuff on the switch, I was definitely could get over 1 gig. We weren't just making up stories to get M gig. If I had a lot of devices doing high throughput, I was gonna hit over that. With Wi-Fi 6E, then I was adding a whole nother radio to that. And so we were definitely pushing. I could easily get over that 2.5 multi-gigabit rate. With Wi-Fi 7, now you'll notice when you see the specs for the APs, we've actually put 10 gig ports on those APs. Again, when you really push it, if I'm close to the AP, so I'm hitting the 4K QAM data rates, I could actually really try to push it and get past that 5 gig. So now is the time to get to 10 gig. So bottom line is, and again, Anand will talk about this afternoon when he talks about the new APs. When I'm looking at the switching infrastructure, anyone that's looking now to move to Wi-Fi 7, the 2 things I'm looking at is multi-gigabit, and I'm looking at UPoE. Because now, as I add in the extra radios and what I'm trying to do with this, I finally crossed that threshold to get me into UPoE to BT power. With the Wi-Fi 6 and 6E access points, we did everything we could do to keep that down. I actually could still maintain full wireless capability with just AT power. I have to disable things like USB ports and some things like that, but I still could get the full capability. But with Wi-Fi 7 now, we've crossed 30 watts, and so it's a UPoE world. So we actually, if you ever lift up a Cisco AP, it's heavier than most things. And part of the reason for that is there is a big metal plate in there, which we use to dissipate the heat. We also use it because we've got to do a bunch of shielding for the different radios and things like that. So we definitely put the, dealing with the heat into how we design it. All the APs are what they call plenum rated, which means it is safe to put in the ceiling. We're not worried about, fires and things like that. Yeah. All right, let's bring it home and wrap things up. I just want to summarize kind of all the different things that we talked about. So number one, most important thing, I have two levers when it comes to my wireless network. What can I do? I can increase the signal and decrease the noise. If I can't do one of those two things, don't call me up and tell me the Wi-Fi is not working right, okay? Number two, we went through the 3 dimensions of Wi-Fi. Spatial multiplexing, got to think about the capabilities of the client, digital modulation, signal to noise ratio, and channel aggregation. Keeping fingers crossed, ACMA is going to give us the full 1200 megahertz. Just because he's here, I want to give a shout out to Phil from Deakin University. He did some really good work with me, helping us make our argument to the ACMA. Had some other companies here in Australia. Also give a shout out to the Sydney Opera House, because I figured if I couldn't convince the ACMA by saying the Sydney Opera House needs more spectrum, there wasn't going to be a whole lot more that I could do. So there we go. The other piece is really think about my design, and not just from the access point perspective. Think about the clients. What type of clients do I have in my environment? What applications are they going to be using? How are people going to be moving about that environment? I know we often focus on client devices like these, but I do a lot of work in all different types of verticals. If I'm talking about a distribution center, I've got these handheld scanners that people are going to be taking down the hallways in the warehouses. Those hallways are big metal shelves, and it's always different what's on those metal shelves. And even if they keep it consistent with what they put on the shelves, then like the company goes and changes to foil bags, which changes the characteristics of everything. So always be thinking about what those devices are, what the environment is. Take advantage of the features and capabilities that we have, and really use the planning tools, do the site surveys. Thank you all very much. Thanks for spending time with me this morning. Hope you got a lot out of it. Really quick, please fill out your surveys. I look at the comments every Cisco Live that I do. I try and take that feedback in as I redo the session. Tomorrow, at the keynote deep dive, that one there, the Smart Secure Seamless, that's where they're going to launch the Wi-Fi 7 APs, but you can get a sneak peek tonight with a lot more detail at a non-session. It's like the 4:15 end of the day. Please go down to Cisco Live World of Solutions. Tons down there. I told you Ekahau and Amina, lots of other partners. We've got the Wi-Fi 7 APs there. You can go and take a look and touch them and feel them and see what they're like. Have a great rest of the week. Thank you all very much.